Norfolk, Virginia. April. The storage unit in Virginia Beach had been locked since 2018. Not because Robert Harrington had forgotten what was inside. He had not forgotten. He knew the make and the model and the year and exactly what the chassis number meant. He had known all of it since 1962, when he was 26 years old and a used car dealer on Granby Street had told him the car was impractical. Too European, the dealer had said, for a man starting out in Norfolk. Robert had written the check anyway. He had kept that car for 64 years without telling a single person he had it. Not his wife, not his business partners, not his daughter Claire, who had grown up in the same house where he kept the garage key on a hook beside the back door and had never once asked what it opened. Some people keep things quietly. Robert Harrington was that kind of person. He died in January 2026 at the age of 81 from heart failure, in the house on Great Neck Road in Virginia Beach where he had lived for 40 years. Claire found the storage unit key in his will on the fourth reading, in a paragraph she had almost missed because she had been looking for something else. The unit was in Oceana. It cost $920 a month. She had been paying it for 3 months without knowing what was inside. She called Whitfield Auto on a Monday morning. The man who answered ran a small garage on Church Street in Norfolk. His name was James Whitfield. He said he could be there by Wednesday. He did not know, when he said it, what Wednesday would open. James Whitfield had grown up in Norfolk understanding 2 things about the water. The first was that it was always there. The second was that it did not care about you specifically. The Chesapeake Bay did not arrange itself around the schedules or the ambitions of the people who lived beside it. It simply existed on its own terms, and the people of Norfolk either learned to work with that fact or spent their lives surprised by it. James had learned early. His father had worked at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard for 31 years. His mother, Rose, had worked at Centara Norfolk General as a floor nurse for 28. They had raised James on Ward's Corner with the particular set of expectations that working people in port cities pass to their children. Show up, do the work, know your trade well enough that your hands are worth something. James had enlisted in the Navy at 18. 8 years as a petty officer first class, most of them aboard the USS Harry S. Truman, which was homeported at Naval Station Norfolk and which required the kind of mechanical precision that James had been practicing in one form or another since his father first handed him a wrench at age 9. He was good at the work. He was good at the patience the work required. He was good at the specific discipline of a man who understood that machines did not forgive imprecision and who had decided early on that he was not going to be imprecise. He had met Hans Dieter at a car show in Norfolk in 2014. Hans was 63 years old, retired from Mercedes-Benz Classic Center in Stuttgart after 31 years, and had been living in Virginia Beach for 7 years because his American wife had grown up there and had agreed to Stuttgart on the condition that Stuttgart would eventually agree to Virginia Beach. He had walked up to James beside a 1960 Mercedes-Benz 220S at the show and had said without introduction, "You see the hairline crack in the subframe mount." James had seen it. Hans had looked at him differently after that. The sponsored work visa had taken 8 months to process. James had arrived in Stuttgart in February 2015 with a duffel bag and the particular focus of a man who had spent 8 years learning that preparation was the only thing that reliably preceded good outcomes. The Mercedes-Benz Classic Center was not a garage in the way that most people understood garages. It was where Mercedes kept its history. The cars, the documentation, the knowledge of what had been built and why, and the people who worked there treated that history with the seriousness it deserved. James had spent 5 years learning the language of old Mercedes the way surgeons learn anatomy. Not from manuals, from the cars themselves. He had learned which chassis numbers said what. He had learned the specific sound of an M198 engine starting cold and what that sound told you about the condition of the fuel injection system. He had learned to read welds the way a forensic examiner reads wounds. Not for what they showed, but for what they did not show. for the absence of things that should have been there. He had authenticated 19 pre-war and post-war Mercedes in 5 years. He had been wrong once. Hans had let him sit with that for 10 days before explaining why. That was how Hans taught. The lesson went in deeper that way. He had met Denise through a video call in 2017. She was a nurse at Centara Norfolk General, a friend of a friend, and she had the specific directness of someone who had spent years in emergency rooms and had learned that time spent not saying the true thing was time wasted. They had married in Norfolk in 2018. Maya had been born in 2019. Denise had died in April 2020. COVID moved through the hospital fast and specific that spring. James had been in Stuttgart. He had boarded the first available flight and had not been in time. Maya had been 11 months old. James's mother, Rose, had held Maya in the hospital waiting room, and James had walked in from the airport still carrying his bag, and Rose had looked at his face and had not needed to say anything. He had not gone back to Stuttgart. He had stayed in Norfolk and had lived with Rose for 14 months while he found his footing. Rose had kept Maya during the days. James had worked on cars in the driveway, neighbors' cars, friends' cars, anything that needed doing, because working kept his hands occupied and his hands occupied kept everything else manageable. He had opened Whitfield Auto on Church Street in January 2022. Maya was 8 now. She kept a small collection of things on the shelf beside her bed. A Navy insignia patch James had worn, a photograph of Denise in scrubs laughing at something off camera, a field guide to Chesapeake Bay birds, and a composition book in which she wrote down questions she wanted to ask James when the time felt right. She had not yet asked all of them. James had not yet answered all of them either. Rose came every morning at 7 to walk Maya to school. She brought sweet potato pie on Saturdays. She had been bringing sweet potato pie on Saturdays for as long as James could remember, and before that her mother had brought it, and before that her mother's mother, and the recipe had traveled from somewhere in South Carolina to Norfolk sometime in the 1940s and had never left. James had told Maya once that the pie was for when you did not know what was going to happen next. Maya had written that down in her composition book. On the Wednesday morning, he drove to the storage unit in Oceana. Maya had been at school, and Rose had been at the kitchen table reading the paper. James had kissed his mother on the top of her head on the way out, and she had said, without looking up, "Call me if it's anything good." He had said, "I will." He had not known, when he said it, how long that call would take. Virginia Beach Storage on London Bridge Road. Unit 14B. The roller door went up slowly, the way storage unit doors go up when they have not been opened in years, with the specific resistance of metal that has settled into stillness and is not entirely willing to be disturbed. James stood in the entrance. 3 vehicles, all under canvas tarps. The flooding water line was visible on the concrete block walls, approximately 16 inches up from the floor, a dark stain that told you exactly how high the water had come in 2018 and exactly how long it had stayed. The tarps were water-stained at the bottom edges. The air had the particular smell of old water and old rubber and something underneath it, something mechanical and specific that James recognized before he could name it. He started at the back. The 3rd vehicle was large. He pulled the tarp and found a 1958 Mercedes-Benz 220S Ponton, the big 4-door sedan, flood-damaged at the lower body, floor pan rusted through, doors seized. Salvageable by someone with time, not exceptional. The 2nd vehicle was smaller, a 1963 Mercedes-Benz 190SL. The Roadster is the elegant one, the one people put on posters. Flood damage had destroyed the interior completely. The top was mildewed beyond recovery. The drivetrain looked intact, worth $45,000 in this condition to the right buyer. He moved to the 1st vehicle. The tarp was different from the others. Someone had used 2 layers. The edges were not just draped over the car. They had been tucked underneath it, carefully, the way you cover something when you know it will be a long time before anyone returns. The tarp itself was heavier canvas, not the standard hardware store variety. Robert Harrington had prepared this one differently. James pulled the tarp from the rear first. The roofline appeared. He stopped, not because he did not recognize it, because he did. The specific curve of a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL roofline was not something you confused with other cars. It was not something you forgot once you had seen it in person. He had spent 5 years in Stuttgart in a building that contained 3 of them, and the roofline was in his hands and his eyes, the way some knowledge becomes part of your body rather than your mind. He pulled the rest of the tarp. Grand Sport white, Gullwing doors, both closed the way they had been since 2018. The specific drama of those doors, even closed, even flood-damaged, even covered in 8 years of storage dust, was present in the way that certain things remain exactly what they are, regardless of circumstance. James stood back and looked at it for a long time. Then he took out his phone and photographed the chassis plate. He photographed the engine bay through the hood gap. He photographed the interior through the window. Destroyed, as expected. Carpet black with mold. Dashboard cracked from years of moisture and temperature cycling. But the structure beneath the destruction was intact. He helped his 2 assistants load the 190SL and the 220S onto the first flatbed. He drove the 300SL himself on a second trailer back to Church Street. He did not call Claire Harrington until he had been in the garage for 3 hours. When he called, he said, "Miss Harrington, I need to ask you about the white car." She said, "Which one is that?" The specific casualness of that answer. James said, "The one under the double tarp." She said, "The insurance adjuster said it was a flood-damaged replica." He listed it as a 190SL copy, said it was worth about $45,000. James said, "When was that?" She said, 2018, after the flooding. James said, "I see." She said, "Is there a problem, Mr. Whitfield?" He said, "I am still assessing. I will call you when I have more information." He hung up and looked at the car. The chassis plate was on the left door jamb. He cleaned it with solvent and a cloth, carefully, the way you clean something when you need to read what it says. The number began with W198. W198 was the internal Mercedes-Benz designation for the 300 SL, not the 190 SL, not a replica of either, the 300 SL Gullwing. He sat back on his creeper and looked at the ceiling of the garage for a moment. Church Street was doing what it always did outside, existing, ordinary, Norfolk going about its business in the particular unhurried way of a port city that has been going about its business for 300 years. He called Hans Dieter that evening. Hans answered on the second ring. James said, "I need to tell you something." Hans said, "Tell me." James told him. Hans was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your unit in Stuttgart. Bay 7, the silver one. Do you remember how the chassis plate was mounted?" James said, "Original rivets. Same oxidation as the surrounding metal." Hans said, "Look at yours the same way." James looked, original rivets, same oxidation. He said, "Hands." Hans said, "I know." James said, "The adjuster listed it as a 190SL replica." Hans said, "The adjuster was either incompetent or he was not." James said, "I know which one." Hans said, "Yes, I think you do." Thomas Vick arrived the following morning without calling. He was 61 years old and had sold European classics in Virginia Beach for 35 years, and he walked into Whitfield Auto with the particular confidence of a man who had decided, before he arrived, how the conversation was going to go. He had known Robert Harrington for 20 years. He had offered to buy the car collection twice. Robert had refused both times without explanation. Thomas had been waiting for Robert to die. He had expected to deal with the estate directly. He had not expected a Church Street garage to get there first. He circled the 300 SL without speaking. Then he said, "I've sold 4 Gullwings in 35 years. I know every one on the East Coast. This is not a numbers-matching original. The adjuster already assessed it. James was under the car on his creeper. He did not roll out. He said, "The chassis plate is on the left door jamb." Thomas said, "I've seen the insurance report." James said, "Look at the chassis plate." Thomas looked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "$60,000. Cash. Today." James rolled out. He stood up. He looked at Thomas. He said, "The chassis number is W198. You can look up what that means." He rolled back under the car. Thomas stood in the garage for a moment longer. Then he left without saying anything else. Maya came home from school at 3:30. She set her backpack on the hook beside the door and climbed onto her stool and looked at the car on the lift. She said, "Dad, is that the special one?" James said, "I think so." She said, "How special?" He said, "Very." She opened her composition book. She said, "I'll write it down when you're sure." James looked at his daughter across the garage. He said, "That's exactly right. The M198 engine was the reason the 300SL existed." That was what Hans had told James in the first week in Stuttgart, standing in Bay 7 beside the silver one with the hood open and the morning light coming in through the high windows. The M198 was the first production car engine in the world with direct fuel injection. Bosch mechanical injection, developed from racing, adapted for the street. It produced 175 horsepower in an era when that number meant something specific and rare. The engine was the reason for everything else. The Gullwing doors existed because of the space frame chassis, the tubular steel structure that gave the car its stiffness and its lightness, and that made the door sills so high that conventional doors were not practical. The Gullwing doors were not a design choice. They were an engineering solution. They were the car telling you, in the most direct way possible, what it was built from. James had spent 5 years learning to read that conversation. He began with the engine number. The number on the M198 block was stamped in the specific location and the specific typeface that Stuttgart used in 1955. He photographed it and cross-referenced it against the documentation Hans had helped him locate through the Mercedes-Benz Classic registry. The same registry he had accessed for 5 years in Stuttgart, the same records that told you exactly which engine had been installed in which car on which day. The numbers matched. He moved to the space frame. The tubular steel space frame of a genuine 300SL had specific weld characteristics: the diameter of the tubing, the angle of the joints, the particular way the welds had been finished by the hands of the craftsmen who built them in 1955. James had seen enough original space frames in Stuttgart to know what right looked like. He went over every accessible weld point with a work light, photographing as he went. The welds were original. The fuel injection system, the Bosch mechanical injection that made the M198 what it was, had been damaged by the flooding. The fuel lines had corroded. The injection pump would need rebuild. But the components were original. The specific casting marks on the injection pump housing match the 1955 production specification exactly. He was 4 hours into the documentation when he found the other thing. He had been working at the steering wheel, checking the column for flood damage, when he noticed something on the center hub. The hubcap was dirty, darkened by years of moisture and age, but when he cleaned it with solvent, he could feel something beneath the surface. He picked up the UV work light. In the ultraviolet light, engraved into the steel of the hub center in letters approximately a quarter-inch high, were 2 initials: R.H. Robert Harold Harrington. James held the light steady. Robert had engraved his initials into the steering wheel hub the year he bought the car. The engraving was as old as the patina around it. A young man of 26, buying a car he had been told was impractical for a man starting out in Norfolk, making sure it knew who it belonged to. The garage was very quiet. James looked at the initials for a long time. Then he called Hans. Hans answered immediately. James said he engraved his initials in the steering wheel hub, under UV. Hans was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me everything." James sent 44 photographs and a 36-page analysis. Hans called back in 50 minutes. He said, "James, this is a genuine 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. Everything confirms original matching numbers. The flood damage is cosmetic and mechanical, interior and fuel system. The structure is sound. The chassis is sound. The engine is sound." James said, "I know." Hans said, "You knew before you called me." James said, "Yes." Hans said, "Your father would have known too." James looked at the photograph of his father that sat on the corner of his desk. Robert Sr. in his shipyard coveralls, 1987, squinting in the Norfolk sun. The specific expression of a man who knew his trade and did not need anyone to confirm it. James said, "Yes, he would have." Hans said, "What are you going to do?" James said, "The right thing." He called Claire Harrington that evening. She answered on the third ring. He said, "Miss Harrington, I need to show you something about your father's car. Can you come to Church Street?" She said, "Mr. Whitfield. The insurance already settled this in 2018. He said, "I know." She said, "The adjuster said it was a replica." He said, "I know what the adjuster said." A pause. She said, "What are you telling me?" He said, "I am telling you that your father paid $3,200 for a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing in 1962. I am telling you that the adjuster reported it as a flood-damaged 190SL replica, and I am telling you that those two facts are not compatible." The line was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I will be there Thursday morning." He said, "I will have everything ready." Claire Harrington drove to Norfolk on a Thursday morning in early May. She had been to Norfolk twice since her father died, once for the will reading, once to deal with the bank accounts. She had not been to Church Street before. She drove past the garage once before she recognized it. The hand-painted sign was smaller than she expected for a man who turned out to know what he knew. She parked and walked in. A girl was sitting on a stool near the door. 8 years old, Claire guessed, with the particular composed attention of a child who had spent enough time in adult spaces to have learned that adults were worth watching. She was holding a composition book open on her lap. She looked up when Claire entered. She said, "Are you Miss Harrington?" Claire said, "Yes." The girl said, "Dad is in the back. He said to tell you he'll be right out." Claire said, "Thank you." The girl said, "Would you like some sweet potato pie?" Claire looked at her. The girl was already moving toward the small table near the office door, where a ceramic dish sat covered with a cloth. She cut a slice with the careful precision of a child who had been taught to do this correctly and placed it on a paper plate with a plastic fork. She carried it to Claire with both hands. She said, "Grandma Rose makes this when she doesn't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if that's where you are right now, but there's enough for everyone." Claire took the plate. She looked at it. Her father had brought sweet potato pie to every Harrington family dinner for as long as she could remember. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Sunday dinner when Claire was growing up. He had never explained where it came from or why he always brought it. He had simply arrived with it, set it on the table, and said nothing about it. She had never asked. She had never thought to ask. She stood in a garage on Church Street in Norfolk holding a paper plate with a plastic fork and understood, for the first time, that there had been an entire world inside her father that she had never thought to ask about. Maya had already returned to her stool and her composition book. James came out from the back wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at the plate in Claire's hands. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Claire. He said, "Thank you for coming." He did not say anything else about the pie. He set the documentation package on the workbench between them and opened it. He walked her through everything without editorializing. The chassis number, the engine number, the space frame welds, the fuel injection casting marks, the Stuttgart registry correspondence that Hans had helped him pull. He placed each document in front of her and gave her time to read it. When he reached the UV photograph of the steering wheel hub, she was quiet for a long time. R.H. Robert Harold Harrington. She said, he put his initials on it. James said, in 1962. When he bought it. She said, he never told me. James said, some people keep things because the keeping is enough. They don't need anyone else to know. She looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then she said, the insurance adjuster reported it as a replica. James said, yes. She said, was he wrong, or was he lying? James said, the title search will tell us that. I have a Virginia title attorney pulling everything from the 2018 claim. She set the UV photograph down carefully. She said, Mr. Whitfield, why are you showing me this? The contract I signed gives you full legal ownership. James looked at her. He said, because it's your father's car. You should know what he had. She said, you didn't have to tell me. He said, no. She said, most people wouldn't. He said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what happens now? He said, I apply for a Virginia rebuilt title. It takes 60 to 90 days. Then Barrett-Jackson Scottsdale in January. If the authentication holds, and it will hold, it should bring between $1.4 and $1.8 million. Claire looked at the 300 SL on the lift. The Gullwing doors were closed. Even in a Church Street garage under fluorescent work lights, the car had a presence that the room organized itself around. That was the thing about certain objects. They did not need to announce themselves. She said, he paid $3,200. James said, in 1962. She said, and he kept it for 64 years without telling anyone. James said, yes. She said, he was like that. She picked up the UV photograph of the steering wheel hub again. R.H. in the steel, a 1/4 inch high, the engraving of a 26-year-old man making sure his car knew who it belonged to. She said, I think I understand him better now than I did when he was alive. James said, that happens sometimes. She said, does it get easier? He looked at her. He said, it gets different. Maya looked up from her composition book. She said, Miss Harrington, did your dad like cars? Claire looked at the girl. She said, I didn't know he did. Until now. Maya considered this. She wrote something in her composition book. Then she said, Dad says some people love things on the inside. He says the inside ones are the realest kind. James looked at his daughter. Maya had already gone back to her book. The title attorney called James on a Friday afternoon in late May. She said, Mr. Whitfield, the 2018 insurance adjuster report lists the vehicle as a flood-damaged 190 SL replica. Estimated salvage value $45,000. But the adjuster, Marcus Webb, has a documented relationship with a salvage company called Hampton Roads Auto Salvage. James said, tell me. She said, Hampton Roads Auto Salvage is registered to a Derek Cousins. Marcus Webb and Derek Cousins are listed as co-investors in a Chesapeake Bay marina property purchased in 2019. The timing suggests Marcus Webb arranged for the undervaluation specifically to enable Hampton Roads Auto Salvage to purchase the collection at salvage prices. James said, but Robert kept the vehicles. She said, Robert kept the vehicles, which meant Marcus Webb's plan failed in 2018. He has been waiting for the estate to liquidate since Robert died. James said, he came to the garage. She said, when? James said, 2 weeks ago. Offered me $70,000. She said, that is significantly above salvage value. James said, yes. She said, Mr. Whitfield, I am going to recommend you contact the Virginia State Corporation Commission and the Virginia Bureau of Insurance. He did. The investigation moved with the specific efficiency of insurance fraud cases that have clear documentation. Marcus Webb had made the mistake that careful fraudsters sometimes make. He had been so confident in Robert's stubborn secrecy that he had not been careful enough with his own paper trail. By mid-June, the Bureau of Insurance had opened a formal investigation. By July, Marcus Webb had been charged with insurance fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The insurance company called Claire in late June. They offered a supplemental settlement of $890,000. She called James the same afternoon. She said, "They settled." He said, "I heard from the attorney." She said, $890,000. He said, "That is fair, given the numbers." She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I want you to know something. I have spoken with my attorney. The contract I signed is valid and enforceable. Whatever that car brings at auction, I have no claim to it. I want you to know that I understand that, and I am not going to try to change it." James said, "I know." She said, "My father kept that car for 64 years. I think he would have wanted it to go to someone who knew what it was." James said, "I will take care of it." She said, "I know you will." The rebuilt title came through in late July. James had spent 3 months on the restoration, not a full concourse restoration, a sympathetic restoration, the kind that corrects what time and water had damaged without erasing what 64 years of careful keeping had preserved. New interior, rebuilt fuel injection system, rebuilt brake system. The M198 engine, once the fuel system was addressed, started on the third crank and settled into the specific idle that Hans had described to James in Stuttgart as the sound of mechanical perfection operating as intended. Maya had been in the garage every evening during the restoration. She sat on her stool with her composition book and wrote down what was done each day. On the evening, James started the engine for the first time. She had looked up from her notebook and listened without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "It sounds like it knew it would be found." James looked at her across the running engine. He did not say anything. Some things did not need a response. They just needed to be heard. Thomas Vick came back in September. He walked in on a Saturday morning when James was adjusting the fuel injection timing. James was under the hood. He did not look up. Thomas stood in the garage looking at the restored 300 SL for a long time. Then he said, "I should have looked at the chassis plate the first time." James said, "Yes." Thomas said, "The adjuster report said 190SL replica." James said, "The adjuster report was wrong." Thomas said, "I know that now." He stood there for another moment. Then he said, "It's a beautiful car." James said, "Yes, it is." Thomas left. He did not make another offer. Some things you recognize too late. That is the price of certainty. Barrett-Jackson, Scottsdale, January 2027. Hans had flown in from Virginia Beach. Claire was there. She had called 2 weeks earlier to say she would be in Arizona for a separate matter and that she would stop by if the timing worked. She was already at the consignment area when James arrived, standing beside the car with a coffee, looking at it with the expression of someone who had been reading about 300 SL Gullwings since May. Maya was with James. She had ridden on the plane for the first time, sitting beside him in the window seat with her composition book open on her tray table, writing down what she saw below as they flew over the Appalachians, and then the flat middle of the country, and then the specific brown geometry of the Arizona desert. She had said, somewhere over New Mexico, "Dad, do you think Great-Grandpa Robert knew someone would find it?" James had said, "I think he knew what he had. I think that was enough for him." Maya had written that down. The car came across the block at 2 in the afternoon. The room paid attention the way rooms pay attention when something genuinely rare appears, not the performed attention of buyers trying to appear disinterested, but the real attention of people who understand what they are looking at. Bidding opened at 600,000. It moved. At 1.1 million, the field narrowed. At 1.4, 2 bidders remained. The hammer fell at $1,650,000. Hans put his hand on James's shoulder and said nothing, which was more than Hans usually did and which meant something from him. Claire was standing slightly apart, looking at the car as the auction staff prepared to move it. She was looking at it the way you look at something you've only recently learned to see. She said, "He paid $3,200. James said, "In 1962. She said, and he knew. James said, he always knew. She looked at the car one more time. Then she looked at James. She said, "I'm going to think about him differently now. For the rest of my life, I am going to think about him differently." James said, "That is not the worst thing." She said, "No, it is not." Maya was standing beside James with her composition book. She looked up at him. She said, "Dad, can I write the number down now?" James said, "Yes." She wrote it down. Then she wrote something else beside it in the column she had been keeping since the first day the car came to Church Street. James did not ask what. He already knew. January in Norfolk. The water in the Chesapeake Bay was the color it got in winter. Gray-green and flat, the color of a body of water that has seen enough to have stopped being dramatic about it. The light came in low and specific, the way winter light came in on the Virginia coast, and it fell across Church Street in the particular way that made the ordinary look considered. The auction proceeds arrived by wire transfer on a Tuesday morning. After Barrett-Jackson's commission and Haynes's consultation fee and the title attorney costs and the restoration materials and the transport to Scottsdale, James had cleared $1,341,000. He sat at his desk and looked at the number. Then he did the things that needed doing. Whitfield auto lease renewed for 5 years. New alignment rack, the one he had been calculating he could not yet afford for 3 years. Maya's college fund, established properly at a credit union on Granby Street. A contribution to Centara Norfolk General's Nursing Scholarship Fund in Denise's name. And 2 plane tickets to Stuttgart. For June. He called Hans. Hans answered on the first ring. James said, "I want to bring Maya to Stuttgart." Hans said, "I will call Bay 7 and tell them you are coming." James said, "I want her to see what the work looks like when it is done right." Hans said, "She will see. I will make sure." James said, "Hans." Hans said, "Yes." James said, "Thank you. For the car show. For 2014. Hans was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw you see the crack in the subframe mount. After that, there was nothing to thank. You did the rest." They talked for a while about nothing consequential, which was the best conversation after consequential things had been completed. Claire called on a Thursday evening. She said, "I have been thinking about my father since Scottsdale." James said, "Yes." She said, "I found more photographs. A whole box I had not opened. He is in all of them. Young before I was born. He looks like someone I did not know." James said, "That happens when people keep things quietly." She said, "I am beginning to think he kept a great deal quietly." James said, "Yes." She said, "Is that sad?" He thought about it. He said, "I think it depends on whether what he kept was good." She said, "I think it was." He said, "Then it is not sad. It is just the way some people love things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will be in Norfolk in March, a property on Granby Street." He said, "I know a good place for coffee." She said, "Near Church Street." He said, "Walking distance." She said, "I will call ahead." He said, "That would be different." She said, "Is that a yes?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night." He sat at his desk for a while after they hung up, looking at the empty lift where the 300 SL had been, thinking about how an empty space could tell you exactly what had filled it if you knew how to look. Rose came on Saturday with sweet potato pie. She came every Saturday. She had been coming every Saturday since 2022, since the first week the garage opened, since the week James had carried the folding table in from his truck and set it by the wall, and Rose had arrived with the pie and set it on the table and said, "You need to eat something. That is all. Just eat something." She set the pie on the table. She looked at the photograph James had pinned above the workbench. It was a black and white photograph of Robert Harrington. 26 years old, standing beside a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing on a Norfolk street in 1962. The year he bought it, the year he engraved RH in the steering wheel hub, the year a used car dealer on Granby Street had told him the car was impractical for a man starting out. He was squinting in the summer sun. He looked sure of himself. Rose said, "Who is that?" James said, "A man who bought a car he loved and kept it for 64 years without telling anyone." Rose looked at the photograph for a moment. She said, "That sounds like half the men in Norfolk." James said, "Yes." Rose looked at him. She said, "You doing all right?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Maya doing all right?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Denise would have liked this story." James said, "I know." Rose picked up her coffee cup. She said, "Eat the pie before it gets cold." She went back to her chair. Maya came in from the back of the garage where she had been checking the oil on a customer's car, a task she had taken on 3 months ago because she said she wanted to learn something real, and James had decided that oil was as real as anything. She set her hands on her hips the way James set his hands on his hips and looked at the photograph above the workbench. She said, "Is that Mr. Robert?" James said, "Yes." She said, "He looks happy." James said, "I think he was." Maya looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she went to the table and cut herself a slice of sweet potato pie and climbed onto her stool and opened her composition book and wrote something at the bottom of the page she had been keeping since the first day the car arrived. James did not ask what she wrote. He already knew. Some people love things on the inside. The inside ones are the realest kind.